there. And the way that this works is I'm going to go through and talk about some arguments in favor of these views, both cultural and individual relativism. And then I'll also talk about sort of responses to those arguments and critiques of the views. So I'm not trying to absolutely come down one way or the other and say, hey, you shouldn't accept this philosophically. But on the other hand, the arguments are meant to give you some kind of reasons to at least question these views as they're initially set out. So that's what we'll go through here today and do. So let's start by where we ended last time and just remind ourselves about cultural relativism. So at the very end of last time, I said, well, I mean, what's cultural relativism broadly? It's just the idea that morality is based on one's culture. And that's by itself, I mean, leaves a lot of stuff open, right? I mean, we could talk way more in depth about what that's supposed to mean. And in at least two of the ways that we could say what that's supposed to mean, well, on the one hand, we have something that I call descriptive cultural relativism. And that's just this idea that if we look cross-culturally, we see differences in moral beliefs between cultures. And as a result of those different beliefs between cultures, people come to have different beliefs about what's right or wrong, or good or bad, or what's morally permissible or morally impermissible. So all those kinds of things. And then I said at the very end of last time, there's also this philosophical view, and that's the one that we're going to start by talking about here today. And that's what I call normative cultural relativism. So usually when I talk about cultural relativism, I'm talking about or critiquing the philosophical view. And the philosophical view really is something like this. It says moral beliefs, they may be true or false, but they're not true or false universally. So just to be clear about what I mean by that, I take it that all kinds of what you might call ordinary descriptive beliefs are true or false universally. So San Bernardino is in the state of California. Now you might think that that truth depends on there like being a California and a San Bernardino and populations of people and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, like if somebody somewhere else believed that San Bernardino was not located in California, they just have a false belief. It's true. And it's true regardless of what one believes that San Bernardino is located in California. Similarly, well, I'm using a microphone to record this lecture right now. This here that you're looking at, that's a microphone. Now, of course, you may fail to believe that, or somebody may fail to believe it, right? But just because they fail to believe it doesn't make it any less true. No matter what people believe, this is in fact a microphone. Now, you might think there are facts about our language and that we call this a microphone or that we call San Bernardino as opposed to some other name. But don't worry about that. It's universally true. It's true for everyone that San Bernardino is located in California, even if they don't believe it. It's true right now that I'm using a microphone to record this video, even if people do in fact fail to believe it, right? I mean, nobody should. You can see right now on video that I'm using it, right? But the idea is that those seem to be universally true. It's universally true that the earth revolves around the sun, or the earth isn't flat, or that on non-cloudy days the sky is blue. And you can think of all other kinds of examples that we talked about. So that's why I take it. Those are things that we might think of as objectively true or universally true. And I'm not really going to go into too much detail about what those things mean outside of just these examples. But I will say this, the normative cultural relativism says, well, morality is different. Moral claims, they're not true or false universally, like all the kind of stuff I was just talking about. They're only true or false relative to a culture. They're only true or false relative to a culture. So you might think they're a matter of cultural opinion. There are no objective facts about them. That's true for everyone. They're only true or false relative to a culture. The other thing to say, and of course this is related, is that there's just no like facts about morality that don't come from a culture. So any fact about morality is culturally dependent. That's what morality is, according to this view. So moral values, like what makes something right, wrong, good, bad, morally permissible or morally impermissible, those all have to do with the cultural opinion. Now, again, there may be different ways of spelling out what I mean by cultural opinion, but let's just take one to be basic. I say if the majority of people in your culture have the moral view that, say, something is wrong, then according to that culture, it's wrong. So one way to say, well, what is it for the culture to have a belief? It's just that the majority of people in that culture have a belief. And you may think that has to be refined, right? So it may need to be like a majority that's more than just 50% plus one or not, but it doesn't really matter for the purposes of our conversation here. So if you want to think about it in some way, just think of it as the majority of people in the culture hold that view. Then that is the predominant cultural view. And that's what morality depends on. There are no like further facts about morality outside of that. That's the idea. And you might think at the beginning, well, that something seems plausible about this view. Morality is just a matter of kind of cultural taste. It's because of the way that you were raised that you have the moral views that you have. It's because of the way that I was raised that I have the moral views that I have. And I take it that while we weren't raised in exactly the same way, there's a lot of overlap between us, probably, right? And there's a lot of overlap between many people with what they think is right or wrong and good or bad, and we'll talk about that. But why should we accept this kind of view about morality? Well, I mean, for one thing, you might just think it's an obvious truth about the world. If you think about it, if you listen to the news, if you've read books and all those kinds of things, look, different cultures, if you traveled, they have different moral values for different reasons. And there's nothing necessary about that. So it's not like there are necessary truths about morality or anything like that. Like people who are raised in one culture come to believe certain things, and people who are raised in another culture believe some other things. And sometimes those aren't the same thing. And that's all there is to say about it. And you might think, well, I mean, our culture is the reason that we have the moral beliefs that we have. So, if I was raised thousands of years ago, perhaps I'd have different kinds of views about the role of women in society, or I'd have different kinds of views about whether or not it was acceptable to treat people in certain kinds of ways, right? So I mean, like, because I think that I have, a tolerant worldview, well, that's just because I was raised in a certain kind of culture. But if I had been raised in a different culture, maybe I would have had different views about what was morally acceptable, right? I mean, you might think things like that about yourself, right? That you have certain moral views, but if you had been raised differently or in a different time period, then presumably your moral views would have been different. Okay, that's not saying all that much. I hope that seems obvious. Now, furthermore, and this is starting to get pretty philosophical here. Well, I mean, kind of for that reason, there's just no sense in which any culture's views are really better than any others. In fact, all there is to morality is the culture that we have, the culture that you were raised in. That explains why you have the views that you do. Somebody who was raised in a different culture would have different views, and then, yeah, they'd be different, but there's no like independent reason to think that your views are any better or any worse objectively than someone else's. So that's the kind of idea that you might have if you're sympathetic to this kind of view. Now, what I have on this slide, you'll see these numbered points. This isn't really an argument. This is just a sort of set of considerations that you might adhere to if you're in favor of this kind of view. It's not exhaustive. What I mean by that is, I mean, there may be all other kinds of reasons that you could have for accepting this kind of view, but this is just a loose set of sort of general reasons that I think that people have when they seem to think that cultural relativism is correct. Now, I'm going to get a little bit more specific here with some arguments. And the first and common argument that I'll give is what's called the argument for cultural relativism from cross-cultural disagreement. And this should be very easy to set up given the stuff that we've already talked about, which is of course why I'm doing it this way. Well, here's my premise. My premise is really just a statement of descriptive cultural relativism. My premise just says, well, look, I mean, different cultures, like on the face of the planet Earth, right? Different human cultures have conflicting beliefs about what's morally right or wrong. Right now, for instance, like in the United States, even different people in the United States, right, have different beliefs about whether it's morally right or wrong, for example, to eat animals for food, right? Or to eat specifically sort of higher animals like mammals and birds and those kinds of things. So some people adopt a vegan or vegetarian position in response to what they think are moral reasons for doing so, and other people think that there aren't good moral reasons for doing so. So I mean, people cross-culturally, and this certainly exists across the face of the planet, have different kinds of views. In different cultures, there are different views about whether or not it's acceptable for men and women to be educated in the same way, for instance. Across different cultures and different time periods, there have been differing moral views about whether or not it's acceptable, for instance, to enslave people. I mean, things that seem relatively terrible from our perspective now, maybe didn't seem morally terrible at the time, of course. Okay, so different cultures that currently exist, different cultures across different time periods, they have conflicting beliefs about morality. That's just an observation. It's just an observation. And the conclusion that the normative cultural relativist draws from that is this idea that, well, there are no objective facts, or if you prefer this way of putting it, there are no universal truths, and we just talked about what I meant by that, about morality, about what's right or wrong or good or bad or morally permissible or impermissible. Okay. Think about the state of politics in the United States, right? People wildly disagree with each other. And some of those disagreements seem to be about moral things like abortion, like the role of government in our lives and those kinds of things. Okay. So here's what I take to be the general form of this argument. The general form, if we sort of abstract away from the specific content in this argument, the general form looks something like this. Well, look, different cultures have conflicting beliefs. Different groups of people have conflicting beliefs about something, whatever it is. And now I don't mean necessarily morality, just about something in general. And from that, according to this argument, it's supposed to follow that there's no objective fact or universal truth about that thing, whatever it may be. So again, this general form that I have here on the bottom of the slide is just a more general conception of the ideas that seem to be present in this initial argument as I've laid it out. So the initial argument, of course, says, well, look, if we look cross-culturally, people disagree about what's right or wrong. Therefore, there's nothing more to morality than what people in a culture think. And things can only be true or false relative to the culture, basically. Okay, and the question is this a good argument? And this is why, you know, in the initial part of the course, I set up all this stuff to talk about validity and these principles of arguments. Well, I mean, we can evaluate this argument, and one way that we can evaluate this argument is by thinking about it in a different context and seeing if it seems valid. So let's do that. Let's take a look at this. Here's what I'll call a counterexample argument. And that counterexample argument, I can make it in a number of different ways, but here's one way. Look, some people are conspiracy theorists, right? They think that the moon landing didn't happen. Now, I don't personally think that. I think that you're wrong if you think that, so I think that you're technically incorrect if you think that the moon landing was faked. But there's no doubt that, like, if you get on the internet, there are people who think that the moon landing was fake. There are people who think that the earth was flat. There are people who think that vaccines don't work. All those kinds of things, right? So there are conspiracy theorists. And there are conflicting beliefs, like between people, about whether or not Neil Armstrong actually walked on the moon or whether that was faked, right? Okay. Now, just because there are conflicting beliefs about it, does anybody accept that there's no universal truth about it? Well, it seems like the answer to that question is no, right? And even if you're a conspiracy theorist and you think that the moon landing was faked, then you think that there's a universal truth about Neil Young walking on the moon. You think that it's false. You think that everybody else is misled, right? So I believe that he walked on the moon. According to the conspiracy theorist about the moon landing, I have a false belief. Of course, from my perspective, I think that the conspiracy theorist about the moon landing has a false belief, right? I think it's true that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon. Now, both of us, whether you're a conspiracy theorist or you believe like I do, both of us would accept that there is some fact of the matter. He either did or he didn't. Either did or he didn't. So I don't get the relativity of truth about Neil Armstrong's walking on the moon, just from the mere fact that people do disagree about whether or not he did. Okay, so here's the idea. Just because people disagree about something, it does not logically follow that there's no universal truth about the matter. Again, if we go back, just because people disagree about something, it doesn't follow that there's no universal truth. But that is what the argument from disagreement for cross-cultural cultural relativism says, right? So the critique here is, look, this argument, the first argument on this slide, that's invalid. That's invalid. The conclusion just does not follow from this premise. That does not give us a solid reason to believe. It doesn't give us a logical reason to believe that conclusion merely based on that premise alone. We'd have to add some more to this argument in order to make it valid, right? And then the question is, well, what is it that needs to be added? Okay, so that's the first critique of cultural relativism, which is really not a critique exactly of normative cultural relativism itself as much as it's a critique of an argument for it, one particular kind of argument, the kind of argument that takes as its premise that there's cross-cultural disagreement. Okay, here's another example that I have on the bottom of this slide. Look, it doesn't follow from the fact that people disagree about whether or not September 11th was some government conspiracy, that there's just no fact of the matter about whether or not it was. Of course, I think it wasn't a government conspiracy, and conspiracy theorists think that it was. But we both agree that there's some fact about it. It either was or it wasn't, right? And again, that's the exact same kind of idea that I was just expressing on the last slide. So that's the first critique. The second critique, I'm not going to go into a ton of depth about, but the second critique of the argument is based on something that occurs in the Rachel's piece, which I hope at this point you've had some time to take a look at. And that actually challenges the underlying premise of descriptive cultural relativism. And the question here is moral disagreement really as great as it seems? So perhaps what seem like disagreements about morality are really just disagreements about something else, and they're hidden disagreements about something else that look like people are fundamentally disagreeing about morality, but they're not really. And I'll explain what I mean by this by example, examples similar to the ones that Rachel's uses. So I say, this is James Rachel's claims, the author of this piece that was assigned. Look, there's a lot of cross-cultural agreement about basic moral principles. And if you think about that, I mean, I take it that, like, are you and I members of the exact same culture? I don't know. We're probably pretty close. But I mean, like, there's going to be a lot of agreement between us. I take it much more agreement than any disagreement about morality. I take it that you and I both think things like judging people based on their gender or race alone is wrong, right? I take it that we think like committing violence against people unprovoked is wrong. All kinds of stuff like that, right? So I mean, we have those kinds of views. You might also think that there are some times where violence is morally justified, for instance, in self-defense. I might think something like that. So there's going to be agreement that we have between each other, of course, and presumably much more agreement than disagreement. And what Rachel's claims is, well, actually, even if you look like broadly cross-culturally on the face of the planet, there's probably a lot more agreement than disagreement. So should we really take like cross-cultural disagreement as a good reason at all? I mean, even inductively, should we take it as a good reason to think that normative cultural relativism is correct? And he's going to argue no. So here's the idea behind this. And I'll just give you two examples. So on my next slide, I have some pictures here. Here's the little formula. The little formula is, here's how we get to moral judgments. Here's how people make moral judgments. They take some moral principle, and then they combine that with some further descriptive or non-moral belief, and then they get to a moral judgment. And in order to explain that, here are my cases. So for instance, suppose that somebody thinks, well, look, it's wrong to kill people, and an embryo is a person. This is one kind of anti-abortion argument, right? So aborting an embryo is always wrong. Here's my premise: it's wrong to kill people. Here's my second premise: an embryo is a person, so it follows that aborting an embryo is always wrong. It's always wrong to kill people. An embryo is a person, so aborting an embryo is always wrong. Now, somebody else might apply just that same moral principle, but have a different descriptive belief, for instance, about the status of embryos, and get a very different moral judgment. So in the second case here, suppose that somebody accepts precisely the same principle, but at the same time, they accept a very different claim about the status of embryos. Well, yeah, I mean, accepting that different claim about the status of embryos leads to a different moral judgment. But an argument about the status of embryos, while it has moral implications, is not exactly about itself, about what's right or wrong. It's about whether or not an embryo is in fact a person, right? So we have just the same principle leading to a very different moral judgment, but that's because of a difference in non-moral belief. Now, of course, those non-moral beliefs have moral implications when combined with principles, but they aren't themselves moral principles. Similarly, suppose that somebody thinks that we shouldn't eat intelligent creatures, what we might call sentient creatures, and we'll talk more about this later on in the course. And we say pigs are intelligent, well, then we shouldn't eat pigs, right? On the other hand, somebody might make this argument, and again, these are very simplified arguments on this slide. We'll look at stuff like this like in way more detail later on. But suppose I say that animals don't have rights, so I'm not violating their rights by harming them, so it's fine for me to harm them in order to eat them. Or alternatively, we shouldn't eat intelligent creatures, but pigs aren't intelligent creatures, the kind of intelligent creatures that we shouldn't eat anyways, so we may eat them. And once again, we have a difference of opinion, but that difference of opinion is about some non-moral matter of fact, not about the moral principle in question. So what Rachel's argues is these principles may very well be very similar cross-culturally. So while there are conflicts in moral judgments cross-culturally, there's really no underlying conflict in moral principles. Everyone thinks, for instance, or most people think, for instance, that human beings have, for instance, the right to life, right? And nobody really violates that cross-culturally. If people do end up harming other people and killing them, they think they have a good moral reason for doing so. And of course, the question is whether or not they actually do. Okay. So here are the two critiques so far. The two critiques really center around that initial argument that I gave you, the one that gets us from descriptive cultural relativism to normative cultural relativism. And the critiques go like this. Well, number one, that argument seems to be invalid. Normative cultural relativism just doesn't follow from the observation that moral judgments differ cross-culturally. And number two, I mean, like, descriptive cultural relativism, the idea that there's really all this moral disagreement cross-culturally, maybe we can call that into question because maybe moral principles are really similar cross-culturally. So those are two things. Now, neither of those really overtly demonstrates that normative cultural relativism is false. It's just attacking a certain kind of argument, albeit a common argument, perhaps, for it. Attacking the argument in favor of a claim or the reasons for believing it doesn't exactly give you a reason not to believe it, right? So attacking the premises that lead to a certain conclusion is different from attacking the conclusion itself. But what I'm going to do now is just spend a little bit of time attacking the conclusion itself with some common arguments that are given against cultural relativism as a philosophical idea, right, against normative cultural relativism. So in order to demonstrate this, and I don't know, I mean, whether or not you take these criticisms seriously, that's really up to you. This is to get you thinking about it, is with a thought experiment. And I'll apologize at the outset here for the names of these cultures. I wasn't, so these are fictional, and I wasn't that creative with thinking of the names. So here's the description. So we have this fictional country, this fictional society called Niceland. Oh, and nice land's very nice. In nice land, the majority of people hold that everybody should be treated with respect. What we'd hope for in our own culture, right? We hope that we live in nice land. Sometimes it seems like we don't, but we hope that we live in a culture like nice land where the majority of people believe that everybody should be treated with decency and respect. Great. Then we have jackassia. And in jackassia, the majority of people believe that members of a certain religion are subhuman. They're not really human beings. They have no rights, and it's fine to just treat them terribly. It's fine to treat them in fact, it's fine to murder them. It's fine to eliminate them from the population. They should be cleansed from the population by any means necessary. So we have nice land, where people should be treated with respect, and we have jackassia, where people, I'm not trying to laugh at this, but it's just so extreme, right? Where people are eliminating other people based on their religious beliefs. Okay. Now, I mean, according to cultural relativism, I mean, yeah, people have some views in nice land about people and human beings and respect. And people have some views in jackassia that are in conflict with those in nice land. Let's say, that some human beings that are members of a particular religion aren't worthy of respect. In fact, they should be eliminated. But according to cultural relativism, normative cultural relativism, well, I mean, there's no objective truth about which one of these is better. And the thought here is something like, well, I mean, something seems counterintuitive about this, so it just seems like it's true that nice land is better than jackassia. And of course, if I say that and somebody's a serious cultural relativist, they'll just say in return to me, well, that's because you were raised in a culture that values cultures like nice land. But if you had been raised in jackassia, you'd think differently. Now, you might think about whether or not that's really plausible, right? So, I mean, like, suppose I was raised in a culture that thought that the earth was flat. If I was raised in such a culture, I might think that the earth was flat, but I'd still be wrong. I'd still be wrong. Similarly, if I were raised in a culture that was super racist, for instance, I might be a racist. I mean, I hope not, but I might be if I was raised that way and everybody that I ever encountered thought that way. But the thought is, I'd still be making some kind of mistake. I'd still be wrong, even if everyone that I was around thought that way. Similarly, though in the non-moral case, if everybody around me thought that the earth was flat and I therefore thought that the earth was flat, I'd be wrong. Why? Because the earth isn't flat. If everybody around me was a racist and I held racist beliefs, I'd be wrong because racism is wrong, full stop. And of course, to think that is already to reject normative cultural relativism, because you do then think that there is some standard of morality. There is some objective standard of morality. What makes morality objective? Well, we haven't talked about that at all yet. But this is just the idea that, do you really accept that there is nothing more to morality than just the culture that we're raised in? Is that it? Okay. And I'm trying to make this argument in a number of different ways. Of course, accepting it is up to you. Here's another sort of problem for cultural relativism. And these are really two problems, and they're related to each other. So I'm going to just quickly do them on the same slide here. Another one is individual versus cultural disagreement. So I have this little picture here of the person who stands out relative to the crowd. Think about social reformers. So think, for instance, about the stances taken by somebody like Martin Luther King during the civil rights movement. So presumably there have been people who have views that aren't the views that might be accepted by the majority of the culture. Yet we still think that they can be right even when the majority of the culture has a view that conflicts with theirs, right? So like, consider an individual, for instance, in jackassia, who wakes up one morning and thinks, hey, something is wrong about this. We shouldn't be eliminating people based on their religious views. We shouldn't be treating them poorly based on their religious views. We shouldn't be treating people poorly based on their race or ethnicity or their gender or any of those kind of things. So suppose that that person thinks that. Well, the problem for normative cultural relativism is that normative cultural relativism is going to hold that that person, the person who has the view that conflicts with the majority view of the culture, that that person is wrong. So it's going to say, as soon as somebody holds a view that's in conflict with the majority of the culture that they're a member of, their moral view is wrong. But something seems off about this, right? Something seems counterintuitive about this, because a lot of times we do think that people can stand up to the majority view of a culture and they're right to do so, that it's morally right to do so, that they're correct, and it's the culture that's wrong. It's the culture that's wrong. So the problem, the basic problem is that for normative cultural relativism, whatever view the majority of the culture has is just technically correct by definition, because that's the way that morality is in fact defined by the view. So I say this, cultural relativism implies that the person who stands up, the moral reformer who stands up against the majority view in a culture or society, they say that by definition, that person just has an incorrect view. But we don't think of like abolitionists during the time of slavery as having an incorrect view just because their view differed from the majority view of the time. No, we think that the majority view of the time was in fact incorrect. Okay. The other thing, and this is very related, is that we think that cultures get better and worse over time. So it's definitely my impression, and again, you might question my impression, but you know, I've been around. I take it that I'm older than most of you taking this class, right? But I'm not super old. But during my time being alive, I've seen things change, and many things have changed for the better, in my opinion. And you might think that some things have changed for the worse. So, for instance, right now, partially as a result of the pandemic and all the kinds of, you know, the level of political conversation in the United States, at least, is much more dramatic. It's much more even violent than it has been at any other point during my lifetime, right? So the upcoming political election, the national election in the United States, the level of vitriol on both sides seems to be high, right? Higher than it has been, even though there have been other times that have been, you know, heavily in conflict. So you might think that things have gotten better in our society over the years, even the last 30 or 40 years. You might think that some things have gotten worse. But to think that anything has gotten better, morally speaking, or anything has gotten worse, morally speaking, already assumes that there's some standard that goes beyond whatever the cultural standard is adopted at the point in time that we're talking about, right? So, I mean, if we're a true normative cultural relativist, we just say, look, cultures change. We can't say that any culture is like better or worse, even relative to earlier or later versions of itself. So, you know, I mean, yeah, you might think that the majority of US society used to be much more racist, say 100 years ago, than it is now, And I'm not saying that, you know, people aren't racist now. Certainly some are, but still you might think that it's gotten much better than it was, say, 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, or even 50 years ago, or even 40 years ago, right? But according to the normative cultural relativists, we can't really say that things have gotten better because there's no objective standard by which we could measure betterness. And I hope that that makes sense. So there's really no cultural progress, or alternatively, there's no cultural regress, morally speaking. Cultures just sort of change their minds, their collective minds. And whatever the cultural view is at the time that the culture holds it, well, that's the correct view according to that culture, because that's what makes something morally right or wrong or good or bad. And that's really what normative cultural relativism tells us. And the question is that really plausible? Is that really plausible? Is that a plausible account of what makes something good or bad? And that's what we're analyzing here. We're analyzing a philosophical theory about morality, about goodness or badness, whether or not that can just be something that has to do with what the majority cultural view is. Okay. So these are some critiques. Again, I'm not saying, you know, these are the only critiques. I'm not saying you have to accept these critiques. Some of them may seem better to you than others. But I am saying, think about what you yourself believe about morality. Think about whether or not you believe that it's really just due to culture. If you do, then you would need to have some kind of response to these types of criticisms. So you might think, well, okay, let's forget about cultural relativism. Let's go to a simpler view. Let's not say it has anything to do with the majority view of the culture. Let's just say it's a matter of opinion. In one way of spelling out what someone means when they say that morality is just a matter of personal opinion is to say something like, well, it's really just up to you. Some people think that, hurting animals for fun is wrong. Other people, I don't think like this, but other people think that, taking small dogs and punting them is hilarious, right? So they do it. I don't do that. Don't harm animals. That's terrible. But some people do harm animals, and they just have that kind of view. They think it's morally okay to do so, perhaps. Now, of course, I think that person's wrong, but that's because I have the moral beliefs that I have. That person thinks, well, animals are animals. I can do whatever I want to them. I can own them, and I can do whatever I please. And for that person, it's morally permissible to punt small dogs if that's what they want to do. Okay. It's not legal, by the way, but maybe there are psychos out there who think that that's just morally permissible. So individual relativism is this idea. It just says, look, here's what morality is. It's really just whatever it is that you believe that it is, and it's up to you. It's a matter of your own personal opinion. And not only is it a matter of your own personal opinion, you might think in some sense all of your beliefs are a matter of personal opinion, right? So, you may believe that you're watching a video explaining this stuff right now. You may also believe that this is just, you're in the matrix and, this is fake and like none of this is really happening right now. In fact, we all died 10 years ago. You may believe any number of crazy things and you might think that's up to you. But in ordinary cases, we think that what you believe is either true or false, depending on whether or not it corresponds to the way that the world is. But individual relativism says morality isn't like that. Morality really just is a matter of personal opinion, in much the same way whether or not you think something tastes good or smells good is just a matter of something that's just purely up to you. So suppose that you believe that something is wrong. Well, then the moment you believe it, it is for you. And we can only talk about whether or not things are right or wrong relative to an individual. And again, you and I might agree about a bunch of stuff. But what's right or wrong is really up to the individual on this view. And I say, notice the parallel between this view and the idea that something tastes good. So, you might think, well, there's no universal truth about what tastes good. It's really just up to you. If you think ice cream tastes excellent, think chocolate ice cream tastes good, then for you it tastes good. That's all we can say. If somebody else thinks that chocolate ice cream doesn't taste good, well, then that's up to them. It won't really change your opinion about it, for instance. So this is kind of the view like, well, look, morality is just a matter of personal taste. It's very similar to that. Something seems off about this, and you might think, well, something seems initially plausible about it. We don't have to worry about like defining a culture or what the majority culture views are. It does seem to a lot of people like morality is some kind of a personal opinion, but the question is that all there is to morality? If that was really all there was to morality, well, then of course you'd be infallible. And what I mean by that is you could never be mistaken. As soon as you have the belief that such and such action is right, then it's right. As soon as you have the belief that it's wrong, then it's wrong. And you can change your mind at any time. It's really up to you. And you can never be mistaken. So suppose that, up until you were 7 or 8 years old, you thought that kicking dogs was morally permissible. You didn't do it a lot, but maybe sometimes you kicked a dog and you thought, well, that's okay. There's no problem with that. And then somebody, perhaps your mother or father or whoever, said, look, you really shouldn't kick dogs. That's mean. Dogs don't like that. And you think to yourself, kicking dogs is wrong. I won't do that. I won't kick a dog from now on. Now, all that's happened in that case is that you changed your mind according to individual relativism. It's not like you were mistaken before and now you've come to have some correct view, because the correct view is whatever you think that it is whenever you think it. Now, of course, we could make this example a lot more extreme. Suppose there were a serial killer, and the serial killer goes around and wakes up once a month and thinks to himself or herself, you know, today I'm going to kill someone. Because on the 28th of the month, killing people is acceptable. Now, suppose that every other day, the serial killer thinks to herself, yeah, no, killing people is wrong. Killing people is wrong in all circumstances. But just on the 28th day of the month, she wakes up and she thinks, killing someone is fine the 28th day of every month. Okay. So every month, she changes her mind just on a particular day about the morality of killing people on that particular day. And she kills someone. Well, I mean, like, that's all fine. It's not like at any point in time she's ever mistaken, even relative to her previous beliefs. And that seems really strange. So now it seems like you can never be wrong, and you can never be wrong about morality, ever, ever. We'd be morally infallible. But the argument here goes, look, people just think that they make mistakes about morality all the time. People change their minds. People are convinced by moral arguments. Perhaps you might be convinced by some eventually in this class. I don't know. But if that's the case, well, then you probably think that before you held a view that was mistaken. But according to individual relativism, you can never be mistaken. You can never be mistaken. And this just seems counterintuitive. It's not how we normally think about morality. If I say that something seems counterintuitive, I just mean, well, it's just not how we ordinarily think about it. It's not how we ordinarily think about it. So that's one problem. Okay, this one is fun. This one, I need boxes on the screen, as you can see here, in order to explain it. And this is the disagreement problem. So you'll recall earlier, I had this argument from disagreement for cultural relativism. This is called the disagreement problem for individual relativism. And the disagreement problem works like this. Let's just start so we can see what I'm saying here with an ordinary case of disagreement. So this may seem a little weird, but I take it that people like on the internet do disagree about this kind of stuff. So here we go. Suppose Polly comes along and says the earth is flat. And Lucia comes along and says, well, look, no, I disagree. I disagree. And again, if you were to say to me, hey, look, Ryan, the earth's flat, I'm going to be like, no, it's not. It's a globe. It's a sphere, or roughly spherically shaped, right? Okay. So we can disagree with each other. And in this kind of case, it's pretty easy to see, like, what is it that we're disagreeing about? Well, we're disagreeing about something, namely the shape of the earth. So I say, this is our ordinary understanding of things like ordinary disagreement. If I say, this is a water bottle, and you say, no, it's not, it's an elephant, I think I'm right and you're wrong. And I think that we're disagreeing about what this thing is. Similarly, in the case of Polly and Lucia, in the ordinary disagreement case, excuse me, what they are disagreeing about is the shape of the earth. Okay, that's ordinary disagreement. Now contrast that, and this one is going to seem weird, which is why I call it wacky disagreement. Polly says to Lucia, suppose that they're talking to each other, hey, I'm hungry. And Lucia says, I disagree. I disagree with you. How is it that we can make sense of what this conversation is doing, right? So one thing that you might notice is this is really weird. People don't get into this kind of disagreement. People do disagree about like the shape of the earth or like where things are. I'm like, hey, you know, my keys are in the bedroom, and my girlfriend is like, no, they're not. You know, people disagree about ordinary things like that. But like people don't disagree with each other about their own hunger, or at least that'd be a really weird thing to do. So I say this, I mean, like, how could we even understand what was occurring in this if you just look at that second wacky disagreement? Well, one way is to say what Lucia is disagreeing about is like Polly's hunger. So Polly says, I'm hungry, and Lucia is like, I disagree with you. Well, maybe what she's saying is something like, Polly, you're not hungry, right? maybe you could think of a context in which there could be a conversation with this between like a parent and a very, very small child or something like that. Like the parent would think that the child was lying about his or her own hunger. But that'd be really weird. So if you say I'm hungry, I'm never going to disagree with you about your own hunger state. If you say it, I take it that you are, because it's really up to you and your own sort of internal state as to whether or not you're hungry. So that would be a really weird thing to disagree about. That's the first option. The second option, you might interpret this as Lucia saying something like, well, I'm not hungry, like in reference to herself, But if that's the case, then there's not really a disagreement here, right? Because it's perfectly compatible, like in the world, that Polly is hungry and Lucia is not. So, I mean, like, Lucia doesn't really disagree with Polly about him being hungry. If it's the case that she just thinks that she herself is not hungry, they're not really disagreeing about anything. Contrast that with the first case. If you look at the first case, they're disagreeing about something. It can't both be true at the same time that the Earth is flat and the Earth is not flat with respect to its overall shape. But the second one, either it has to be the case that Lucia is disagreeing with Polly about his own hunger, which is really weird, or they're not really disagreeing about anything. Okay, why am I talking about this? Now let's look at the moral case. The moral case is this, and I'll just take this as an example. Polly says, look, abortion in all cases, ever getting an abortion, committing the act of abortion if one is a doctor, all those kinds of, abortion in all cases, all stages of pregnancy is wrong. And Lucia says, I disagree. Now, here's what I take to be the ordinary understanding of what's going on there. What Lucia thinks is that Polly has said something that's incorrect, that's false. And what they're disagreeing about is the morality of abortion. Now, that's pretty ordinary understanding. Suppose that individual relativism is correct, and morality is just true or false. Moral statements are just true or false relative to an individual. Well, then it looks like we get into what amounts to a wacky disagreement, not an ordinary disagreement. Why? Because, I mean, like, what would they be disagreeing about? Either Lucia is disagreeing with Polly about his own beliefs, which seems really weird. Like, if I disagree with somebody about abortion, I'm not disagreeing with them about what they themselves believe about abortion. I'm disagreeing about the moral status of abortion, not their beliefs or that they have the beliefs that they have. Alternatively, we could go in the second way with this, and we could say, what's happening there? Well, Lucia is just saying that she believes that abortion is not wrong. I'm missing the wrong there at the bottom of the slide, but that's what I mean to say there. So Lucia is saying that she believes that abortion is not wrong in all cases. Right? But if that's right, that's not really a disagreement. They're both sort of asserting their own beliefs, but they're not disagreeing with each other. There's nothing to disagree about. That's the problem for individual relativism, is that moral disagreements either look really, really weird, like you're disagreeing with each other about what you believe, that you believe what you believe, or you're not really disagreeing with each other at all. But neither of those kinds of disagreement, or if you want to call that disagreement, seem to be the kind of disagreement that people actually get into about morality. If somebody is out on the street protesting abortion, you're not going to walk up to them and be like, well, but I believe that abortion is not wrong. And they're like, well, I have my beliefs and you have your beliefs, and that's it. If somebody is protesting out in the street that racism is wrong, you're not going to walk up to them and be like, well, that's just what you believe, and I have beliefs that conflict with your beliefs, and that's it. No, people take it that they actually are disagreeing about something when they disagree about morality. And that's the idea. The idea here is that individual relativism cannot correctly account for what we observe in people behaviorally when they actually disagree about morality. People, when they disagree about morality, it's much more like ordinary disagreement. They take themselves to be disagreeing about something, and that they can't both be right if they disagree. In ordinary disagreement, we take ourselves to be disagreeing about something, and we can't both be right if we disagree. Okay, so that's the disagreement problem for individual relativism. Okay, we're almost done. I just want to say before moving on from this, you know, these aren't all the arguments to be given. These are just very common ones, and they should be familiar to you at this point based on the readings. So I have the readings in the folder from last week about relativism, and I hope that you've gotten a chance to take a look at those. So I mean, you might think, I'm not trying to say, look, hey, relativism is totally wrong. It's just we'd have to say a lot more about it in order to sort of rescue it from these criticisms. And I'm really just want you to think about what are your own personal views with respect to this. Do you really think that morality is just a matter of cultural opinion? Do you really think that it's just a matter of individual opinion? Or do you think that there are some things that are absolutely right and absolutely wrong? If you think that there are some things that are absolutely right and absolutely wrong, or universally right or universally wrong, well, I mean, there has to be a reason for that. There has to be a reason for that. And of course, philosophically, we have to try to figure out what that is. Okay. So, I mean, you might think that cultural relativism, something seems right about it as a descriptive theory, but as a normative moral theory, it seems to have a number of problems. And again, we'll keep talking about normative moral theories in this course, at least at this point in this course. And what they are trying to do is give us a general account of what makes something right or wrong, or good or bad. And if we think that there are truths about morality, universal truths about morality, we got to have some kind of explanation as to why, some kind of theory about why. And part of this course is to get you to think about these theories and what's potentially wrong with them, what potentially doesn't make sense. Are the arguments for them any good? But the other point of the course, among many other points of the course, is to get you thinking about what is it that you yourself think about these things. Part of the role of a philosophy course and college education in general is to try to get your own thoughts about what you think about these kinds of things clearer, right, as a human being. And that's how we will continue to progress in here.